The night Etta Wilcox was handed over like a poker debt, the saloon in Coldwater Creek smelled of tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and something she could only describe as the particular rot of men who had forgotten what it meant to treat another human being as one. She stood near the bar, her dark hair pinned back with two tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother, her dress the color of dried sage, worn at the elbows but pressed clean, because she had always believed that dignity cost nothing even when everything else had been stripped away. Her hands were folded in front of her, not because she was calm, but because she had learned a long time ago that showing fear only invited more of it. Coldwater Creek sat in the territory of New Mexico in the year 1882, a sun-scorched town of 300 souls that clung to the edge of a dry riverbed like a man clinging to the last rung of a ladder. The railroad had not come through yet, though men argued about it constantly in saloons and general stores. The law existed in the form of a sheriff named Horace Platt, who was 62 years old, fond of his rocking chair, and largely useless in situations that required any actual courage. Etta had lived in Coldwater Creek for 4 years, since the age of 20, when her father had brought her west from Missouri following the death of her mother. Her father, a man named Gerald Wilcox, had been a gambler by nature and a farmhand by necessity. When he died of fever 2 years ago, he left behind a small debt to a man named Roy Calloway, who was the older of the two Calloway brothers, and who fancied himself something between a businessman and a land baron, though he was mostly just a man who had inherited enough money to make other people miserable. The debt had been $40, the kind of sum that could be settled in a season of honest work. But Roy Calloway had decided that Etta herself was the most convenient form of repayment, and because the law in Coldwater Creek was a 62-year-old man in a rocking chair, no one had stopped him. She had spent the last 2 years working in Roy Calloway's household, cooking and cleaning, and managing the affairs of a man she despised with every fiber of her being. She had told herself it was temporary, that she was paying off the debt, that she was keeping track of every hour and every meal and every laundered shirt, and that one day the arithmetic would work out in her favor. But Roy Calloway did not keep that kind of arithmetic. Tonight, things had taken a turn that she had not anticipated even in her darkest moments of imagining what men like Roy Calloway were capable of. Roy's younger brother, Dale Calloway, had ridden into Coldwater Creek 3 days ago. He was 28 years old to Roy's 35, shorter and meaner looking, with pale eyes that reminded Etta of a snake she had once found coiled under the porch steps. Dale had been away for 2 years working cattle drives up in Colorado, and he had come back with calloused hands, an inflated opinion of himself, and an immediate interest in Etta that made her skin crawl. Tonight, in the saloon called the Red Mare, Roy Calloway had sat down with his brother at a corner table, and after 3 rounds of drinks and what appeared to be a negotiation that Etta could not fully hear but could entirely feel in the pit of her stomach, Roy had walked over to where she was waiting near the bar. He had brought her along to carry a parcel he had collected from the general store, and he had said, in the flat casual tone of a man discussing livestock, that she would be going home with Dale from now on. Dale's taking over the debt, Roy said, not looking at her, already turning away. You answer to him now. Etta had not moved. She had not spoken. She stood there with her hands folded while the world inside her chest performed a kind of violent upheaval that she refused to show on her face. The saloon had gone somewhat quieter around that corner of the room. A few men looked away. The bartender, a wide-shouldered man named Cletus, polished a glass with renewed dedication. 2 cowboys at the bar studied their drinks as though those drinks contained the secrets of the universe. Dale Calloway crossed the room toward her with a grin that had nothing kind in it, and Etta thought, with absolute clarity, that she would rather walk into the desert alone at midnight than spend a single night under the same roof as this man. It was in this exact moment, while Dale Calloway was still 3 steps away and still grinning, that a voice came from the far end of the bar. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and somehow capable of cutting straight through the ambient noise of the saloon the way a clean knife cuts through rope. "She's not a debt." Everyone looked. The man who had spoken was sitting on a stool at the far end of the bar, a place he had occupied so quietly that Etta had not particularly noticed him before, though she realized now that he had been there for some time. He had a glass of water in front of him, not whiskey, which was unusual enough on its own. He was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, lean but with the kind of shoulders that came from actual work, wearing a dark coat that had seen weather and a hat that sat pushed back slightly on his head. He had brown hair and serious eyes, the color of which Etta could not quite determine from across the room, and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He was not, by the look of him, a local. Etta had never seen him before in her life. He looked at Dale Calloway when he spoke, then his eyes moved briefly to Roy, then settled somewhere neutral, though his posture had that particular quality of stillness that Etta had seen once before in a man who knew exactly how to handle himself and was not particularly worried about having to prove it. "She's not a debt," he said again, and picked up his glass of water with the easy calm of a man who has nothing to prove and everything to mean. Dale stopped walking. His grin went flat. Roy Calloway, who had been heading toward the door, turned around. "Stranger," Roy said, "I don't know you and I don't know your business, but this here is a private matter." "Private matters stop being private when they happen in public," the man said. He set down his glass. He did not stand up yet. "The woman doesn't appear to be agreeing to this arrangement, which makes it something other than a debt transaction." "She doesn't need to agree," Dale said. "The debt was her father's." "Her father is dead," the man said. "Dead men can't make agreements that bind living women. That's not how law works, and it's not how decency works either." There was a silence in the saloon that had a particular texture to it, the kind where every man present is calculating something. Etta herself was doing her own calculating, looking at this stranger at the end of the bar and trying to determine what his angle was, because in her experience, men who inserted themselves into situations involving women usually had an angle. His eyes moved to her then, direct and unhurried, and he said, "Miss, do you want to go with these men?" It was such a simple question, such a direct and unadorned thing to ask. Etta felt something shift in her chest. "No," she said, "I do not." "There you have it," the man said, and now he did stand up, and he was taller than he had appeared on the stool. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, with the care of a man who understood that sudden movements in saloons had consequences, and he produced a leather wallet from which he counted out $40 in bills and coin onto the bar. "If there is a debt, consider it paid in full. The lady's account is settled." The entire room held its breath. Dale Calloway's pale eyes went narrow. Roy Calloway looked at the money, then at the stranger, then at Etta, doing his own arithmetic. "You've got no right," Dale said. "I've got $40, the man said pleasantly. "Which is the number your brother named as the debt? If the debt is settled, the arrangement is over. Unless one of you wants to argue that $40 isn't $40, in which case I'd be very curious to hear the mathematics." Roy Calloway stared at the money for a long moment. He was not, Etta knew, a man who was afraid of a fight, but he was also a man who could read a room, and the room right now had the particular quality of a room that would not look favorably on whatever happened next if the Calloway brothers were the ones to start it. There were 15 men in this saloon, and while none of them had spoken up before, the stranger's measured intervention had shifted something in the air. Roy picked up the money. He counted it. He pocketed it. He looked at Etta with the flat expression of a man filing something away for later rather than letting it go entirely, and then he looked at the stranger. "I don't know your name," Roy said. "Aaron Barnett," the man said. "You've made yourself an enemy tonight, Aaron Barnett." "I've made myself a record," Aaron said. "Paid a debt in full in front of 15 witnesses. Whatever comes after that is on your end, not mine." Roy Calloway walked out. Dale stood for a moment longer, his pale eyes moving between Aaron and Etta with the cold calculation of a man who was only retreating to a better position, and then he followed his brother. The saloon breathed again. Etta stood very still near the bar. She was aware that her hands, which she had kept folded, were now trembling slightly, not from fear but from the release of the particular tension that had been coiled inside her for the last 20 minutes. She looked at Aaron Barnett, who had sat back down on his stool and returned his attention to his glass of water with the composure of a man who had not just done something that could get him shot. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I don't know what to say to you," she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were gray, she could see now, a particular shade of gray that reminded her of the sky in the hour before dawn. He was not handsome in the way that men in magazine illustrations were handsome. He was handsome in the way that a well-made thing is handsome, clean lines, honest materials built to last. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "You just paid $40 for a stranger." "I paid $40 to close an account that shouldn't have been open in the first place," he said. "There's a difference." Etta studied him for a moment. The bartender had drifted to the far end of the bar with diplomatic purpose. The rest of the saloon had returned to its business, with the relief of people glad to have avoided catastrophe. "I need to understand something," Etta said. "What do you expect in return?" He met her eyes steadily. "Nothing," he said. "I expect nothing. I saw something wrong and I had the means to address it. That's all this is." She searched his face for the lie and could not find one. That was, she thought, either the sign of a very honest man or a very skilled deceiver. She had met enough of both to know that the two were sometimes difficult to distinguish immediately. "Where are you staying?" she asked. "I was going to ask Cletus if there's a room." "There's a boarding house," she said. "Mrs. Adler's on the far end of Main Street. She's decent and she doesn't overcharge." "Thank you," he said. Etta nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "I have nowhere to go tonight," she said, keeping her voice level and matter-of-fact because she had made her peace long ago with saying hard things plainly. "The Calloway house is not an option anymore. I'm not asking you for anything. I just want to know if Mrs. Adler would have 2 rooms." "I'll ask," he said, and there was something in his tone, not pity but a kind of careful recognition of circumstances, that she found she could accept. They walked to Mrs. Adler's boarding house together. Not side by side exactly, with some distance between them, 2 strangers moving through a dark street in a small western town, and Etta was aware of a feeling she had not had in a very long time, which was the feeling of not being entirely alone. Mrs. Clara Adler was a stout woman of 60 with silver hair and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had built a life in the territory through practical application of good sense. She had 2 rooms available. She looked at Etta and then at the man beside her with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen everything and made up her mind about most of it very quickly. "You're Etta Wilcox," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I heard what the Calloway boys were up to," Mrs. Adler said. "Whole town heard. Shame nobody said anything sooner." She looked at Aaron. "And you're the man who did." "Aaron Barnett, ma'am. I'd like 2 separate rooms if you have them." Mrs. Adler looked at him for another moment, then nodded once with satisfaction. "2 rooms," she said. $1.50 each per night, breakfast included." In her room, which was small and clean with a window that looked out over the dark street, Etta sat on the edge of the iron-frame bed and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of the evening. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed slowly. She had been in difficult situations before. She had managed them before. But there had always been, underneath the management, the lonely knowledge that she was managing entirely alone. Tonight, a stranger had said, in a room full of people who had said nothing, that she was not a debt. She thought about that for a long time before she slept. In the morning, Coldwater Creek looked like it always did, sun-bleached and a little ragged. The kind of town that had been built in a hurry and hadn't quite found time since to finish itself. The main street had a general store, the saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, a doctor's office, and the boarding house. There were 2 side streets with residential houses, a livery stable at the north end, and the sheriff's office, which was rarely occupied. Aaron Barnett was already at the breakfast table when Etta came down. Mrs. Adler brought out eggs and biscuits and strong coffee, and Etta sat across from Aaron with the reasonable awkwardness of two people who have been thrown together by circumstances and are still determining what those circumstances mean. "You're not from here," Etta said. "No. I'm from Colorado, originally. I've been working as a land surveyor. The territorial government has been hiring men to survey land claims along the Pecos River corridor. So you're passing through." "For now," he said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "What will you do now?" It was, she thought, the right question, and the fact that he asked it rather than offering to solve it for her made her like him slightly more than she already did, which was already slightly more than she was comfortable with given that she had known him for approximately 12 hours. "I have some money saved," she said. "Not much, but some. And I know how to sew and bake and keep accounts. Mrs. Adler has been talking about needing help around the boarding house. I thought I might ask her." "That sounds like a solid plan," he said. "What about the Calloway brothers?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think Roy Calloway is the kind of man who lets things rest," he said honestly. "He took the money because it was the right arithmetic in the moment and because the room was watching. That doesn't mean he's done thinking about it." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." "I'll be in town for at least 2 weeks," he said. "The survey work has me based here. I want you to know that." She looked at him. He said it without anything weighted in it, just a plain statement of fact, the way a person who means what they say tends to talk. "I'll keep it in mind," she said. She spoke to Mrs. Adler after breakfast, and Mrs. Adler, who was sharp enough to recognize a good arrangement when it was in front of her, agreed on the spot. Etta would help with the cooking, the laundry, and the keeping of accounts in exchange for her room and a small weekly wage. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it was hers. Aaron left after breakfast with his survey equipment, a leather satchel full of instruments and notebooks, heading south toward the river. Etta watched him go from the front porch of the boarding house and told herself firmly that she was not particularly interested in watching him go, and that the warmth she felt had more to do with the morning sun than with anything else. The first real trouble came 4 days later. Dale Calloway had not left town. Roy had returned to their spread east of Coldwater Creek, but Dale had stayed, and he had been drinking more or less continuously for those 4 days in the Red Mare, which was not a recipe for improved judgment. On the 4th evening, he came to Mrs. Adler's boarding house. Etta was in the kitchen when she heard Dale's voice at the front door, and she felt the cold clarity that sometimes comes when a situation you have been bracing for finally arrives. Mrs. Adler was at the door, small and silver-haired and absolutely immovable. "She doesn't owe you anything," Mrs. Adler was saying when Etta came to the hallway. "And you are not welcome in my house." "I want to talk to her," Dale said. "You can want many things in this life," Mrs. Adler said. "I want a proper parlor and the rain to come early this year. We don't always get what we want." Dale's eyes found Etta over Mrs. Adler's shoulder. There was something ugly in them, not just desire, but the specific ugliness of a man who believes that being denied something makes the thing more rightfully his. "The debt's not settled," Dale said to Etta directly. "My brother took the money, but he doesn't get to settle what I'm owed." "You weren't owed anything," Etta said. "Not by me, not ever." My father is dead," she said. "He has been dead for 2 years. Whatever he owed or didn't owe died with him. I am a separate person, not a continuation of his liabilities." Dale's expression darkened. He put one hand on the doorframe, and Mrs. Adler, God bless her, did not step back an inch. A step sounded on the porch behind Dale, and then Aaron Barnett came around the corner, still carrying his survey satchel, still in his working coat, clearly just returned from the day's work, and taking in the situation at the door with the swift, quiet assessment of a man who doesn't miss much. "Evening," he said, to the room in general, but his eyes were on Dale. Dale turned. Something moved in his expression, a calculation, the weighing of odds. He was wearing a gun, and so was Aaron, in the practical way that most men in the territory did, and neither of them moved toward theirs, but the presence of them was part of the calculus. "You're still in my business, Barnett," Dale said. "I'm trying to get to my supper," Aaron said pleasantly. "If you're done with your visit, I'd appreciate getting past." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, which is a long time when the air is the way it was. Then Dale stepped back from the doorframe, not gracefully, not conceding anything in his expression, but stepping back. He looked at Etta one more time with those pale eyes. "This isn't settled," he said. He left. His boots on the porch steps made an angry sound. Mrs. Adler closed the door. She turned and looked at Aaron with the expression of a woman awarding quiet approval. "Your supper is in the kitchen," she said. "Both of yours." They ate together at the kitchen table, just the three of them, Mrs. Adler included, and the conversation was light in the way that conversation is when people have just been through something and need to put it at a small distance. Aaron talked about the river survey, about the way the land along the Picos shifted between mesa and basin, about a particular bend in the river where he had found evidence of an old settlement that predated the current territory claims by what he estimated to be 2 centuries. He talked about it with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who finds the world interesting, and Etta listened and found herself asking questions, and then found herself surprised that she was asking them, because she had not, in some time, had the kind of conversation that made her want to keep it going. After supper, when Mrs. Adler had retired and they were alone in the kitchen with the last of the coffee, Etta asked Aaron the question she had been turning over for 4 days. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. "The $40, you could have kept your head down. Everyone else did." He looked at his coffee. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of evasion, but the silence of someone finding the honest version of something. "My mother," he said, "was in a situation not so different from yours when I was young. Different circumstances, different state, but the same essential wrongness of one person believing they had the right to dispose of another like property." He looked up at her. "I was 8 years old and I couldn't do anything about it. I've had 20 years since then to think about what I would do if I ever had the means to address that kind of thing when I saw it." He paused. "Last week I happened to have $40 and I happened to be in the room." Etta held his gaze. Something in her chest rearranged itself quietly, the way things do when a truth lands in you and finds a space that was already shaped for it. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "She's all right now," he said. "She remarried a decent man and lives in Denver, but those years were hard and she carried them." He turned his coffee cup. "People carry things they shouldn't have to carry." "Yes," she said softly, "they do." Outside, the desert night was doing what it did, which was to be very large and very quiet and full of stars. Etta thought that she had spent 2 years in Coldwater Creek feeling the weight of something that was not rightfully hers to carry, and that tonight, for the first time, the weight felt slightly different. Not gone, but shared with at a distance by someone who understood why it was wrong. She went to bed thinking that Aaron Barnett was either the most genuine person she had ever encountered in the territory, or she was simply out of practice at recognizing genuineness and confusing it with something else. By morning she had decided it did not matter which, because the effect on her was the same either way. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Aaron left each morning with his survey equipment and returned each evening for supper. Etta worked in the boarding house, learned the full complexity of Mrs. Adler's account books, and began to feel something she identified cautiously as stability. She had not felt stable in a long time. On the 5th day after Dale's visit to the boarding house, Aaron came back from the river earlier than usual. He came through the kitchen door looking thoughtful, and Etta, who was at the table mending a pillowcase, looked up. "Roy Calloway came to the survey site today," Aaron said. She set down the pillowcase. "What did he want?" "He wanted to inform me that the $40 I paid does not cover the full extent of what he considers his arrangement with you." Aaron pulled out a chair and sat down. "He claims your father's debt accrued interest over 2 years. He put the total at something closer to $200. Etta felt the old familiar cold of it. "He's inventing that." "I know he is," Aaron said. But the interesting thing is that he said it to me rather than to you, which suggests he's decided that I'm the one he needs to deal with, which is at least somewhat better than him coming here directly. Or it means he thinks threatening you is more efficient than threatening me. That's also possible, Aaron acknowledged. He was looking at her steadily. I want to be honest with you about something. She waited. I've been thinking about this situation, and I think Roy Calloway is going to keep finding reasons to pursue this until either the law steps in or something else changes the equation for him. Sheriff Platt is not useful. The something else he paused. I've been corresponding with a territorial judge named Harlan Cross, who has been working through Roswell. I wrote him 3 days ago regarding your situation, laying out the facts of the original debt, the circumstances, the way it's been handled. I want to know if there's a legal remedy before anything escalates further. Etta stared at him. You wrote to a judge about me. I wrote to a judge about an injustice, he said carefully. I should have told you before I did it. I apologize for not asking first. It was presumptuous. She thought about it. The honest answer was that it was slightly presumptuous and also possibly the most useful thing anyone had done on her behalf in 4 years. What did you tell him? She asked. He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket and handed it across the table. It was a copy of the letter he had written, neat and precise, laying out the situation in plain language. The original debt of $40, the death of Gerald Wilcox, the subsequent treatment of Etta as collateral, the lack of any written or legal documentation of the arrangement, and the payment he had made in full before witnesses. The letter was formal and measured and completely factual, and it treated her throughout as a person with rights rather than a problem to be managed. She read it twice. She folded it and handed it back. Don't apologize, she said. It was the right thing to do. He looked at her with something in his expression that she had been noticing for days, a careful attention that was not the greedy inventory she was used to from men who looked at her, but something quieter and more particular, as though he was trying to understand her rather than possess her. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What did you want to do before all of this, before Coldwater Creek, before your father died? What did you want your life to look like? She was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of question she had stopped asking herself, because asking it had for a long time felt like holding something up to the light that was only going to show her how much she had lost. I wanted to teach, she said finally. I was good at school in Missouri. I read everything I could find. I thought about a school back east, but then my mother got sick and then she died and then my father needed, she stopped. It didn't happen. You're 24, he asked. Yes. It could still happen, he said simply. She looked at him. You're very practical about the future. I spent a few years not being practical about it, he said. It turns out being impractical about the future mostly just means the future happens to you rather than you happening to it. She smiled, the first full unguarded smile she had allowed herself in front of him, and she saw the effect of it in his expression. A brief, uncontrolled warmth that he did not try to hide, and then he looked down at his coffee, and she looked back at her pillowcase, and they were both quiet with the specific, comfortable quiet of people who have moved slightly closer to each other without having moved at all. The response from Judge Harlan Cross came 8 days later. It was delivered to Aaron at the survey office he had set up at the south end of Main Street, and he brought it to the boarding house that evening. He and Etta read it together at the kitchen table. Judge Cross had done some research. Under territorial law, the debt of a deceased person could be claimed against an estate, but there was no provision for that debt to be attached to the person of a living adult family member, particularly in the absence of any written instrument. The arrangement Roy Calloway had been operating was not legal. Furthermore, Judge Cross wrote, the payment of $40 in front of witnesses constituted a settlement of good faith, and any further harassment or coercion of the named individual, Etta Wilcox, would constitute actionable misconduct. The judge had signed it and stamped it with the territorial seal, and he had sent a copy to the sheriff's office of Coldwater Creek and one to the county records. Etta sat very still for a long moment after she finished reading. "It's over," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, too small for what they meant. "Legally, yes," Aaron said. "Roy Calloway has a copy of this. He's not an unintelligent man. He knows this is done." She put her hand flat on the table. She was not going to cry. She had decided a long time ago to be selective about when she cried, and she was going to hold to that, but her throat did something difficult for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and the words were entirely inadequate, and they both knew it, and somehow that made them the right words. Aaron covered her hand with his briefly, just the weight of his palm over her fingers for a moment, and then he moved his hand back to his coffee, and neither of them made anything of it, but Etta felt the warmth of it long after supper was over. A week passed, and then another, and Aaron's survey work was not yet finished. He had mentioned 2 weeks when he arrived, and now 3 had gone by, and he had not spoken of leaving. Etta did not ask about it directly, but she noticed it, the way you notice a particular quality of light that has been present long enough that you start to feel the shape of the absence it would leave. They fell into the easy domesticity of people sharing a household under Mrs. Adler's kind and unintrusive supervision. They ate breakfast and supper together at the kitchen table. On evenings when the heat had broken and the air was the pleasant cool of the high desert at night, they sat on the boarding house porch and talked, sometimes for hours. Aaron had opinions about nearly everything: land law, the best methods for preserving water in the desert, the relative merits of different surveying instruments, the state of literature, the politics of the territory, and he held them without being rigid about them, willing to change his mind when presented with a better argument, which Etta found remarkable because she had met very few men who were willing to change their minds about anything. She talked to him about Missouri, about her mother, who had been a school teacher herself, who had read to Etta every night, who had made the world seem larger and more interesting than the flat farmland they lived on. About her father, who she had loved despite everything, who had been a weak man in specific ways but not an unkind one. About the particular grief of watching someone drink away their circumstances, while knowing the circumstances were partly the drinking's fault. Aaron listened the way he did everything, with his full attention, without judgment, asking questions that showed he had actually been following the thread. On a Tuesday evening in late October, they walked to the edge of town where the land opened up into the wide basin that the Pecos drained, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the sunset, burning orange and rose and a deep arterial red along the western ridge, and they stood side by side watching it with the comfortable closeness of people who no longer needed distance to feel safe with each other. "I've been offered an extension on the survey contract," Aaron said. "Another 3 months, taking me up into the northern part of the territory." Etta looked at the sunset. "That's good work," she said. "It would mean staying in the territory." She said nothing. She was waiting for the rest of it because she could feel the rest of it in the way he had said it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way to say things." She turned to look at him. The sunset light was doing something to his features, making him look both more and less familiar, and her heart was doing something she had tried, not very successfully, to manage for the past 3 weeks. "I would like to court you," he said. "I would like to do it properly, with your permission and entirely at your pace, and with no expectations except the hope that you'll let me keep being near you. I think you are the most remarkable person I've encountered in my 30 years of life, and I'm aware that we met under circumstances that were not uncomplicated, and I don't want any of that to color what I'm asking. This is separate from all of that. This is just me asking if you might want that too." Etta held his gaze. The sunset burned behind him. The desert was very quiet. She had spent 2 years telling herself that she had no time for what she was feeling right now. She had spent 4 years making herself smaller and harder and more practical, filing away the soft things for a future that kept not arriving. She looked at Aaron Barnett, who had walked into a saloon and spent $40 and written to a judge, and listened to her talk about her mother for 3 hours one evening without once looking at the window, and she thought that the soft things perhaps had been waiting for the right condition to grow in. "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." He smiled, and it was a full and unguarded thing, and Etta thought she had never seen someone's face change so entirely and so honestly. They walked back to the boarding house side by side, and this time their hands found each other halfway down the main street, and neither of them made any particular event of it, which was, she thought, exactly right. Mrs. Adler was sitting on the porch when they returned, knitting by lantern light, and she looked at their joined hands and said only, "There's pie in the kitchen," with the satisfied tone of a woman whose predictions have come true. In the weeks that followed, Coldwater Creek witnessed the quiet and entirely unspectacular beginning of a love that had nothing performative about it and everything sincere. They went for rides on Sunday afternoons, Aaron on the gray horse he'd stabled at the livery, and Etta on a brown mare she borrowed from Mrs. Adler's neighbor. They visited the general store together and argued amiably about whether coffee or tea was the more civilized morning drink. He brought her books from a box he had shipped from a Denver bookseller, and she read them and marked pages, and they discussed them in the evenings with the intensity of people who are using books to also talk about themselves. Roy Calloway was seen in town twice during this period. He did not approach Etta. He looked at her once with the expression of a man who had lost a game, and was not entirely sure what game he had been playing, which was, she supposed, the appropriate resolution. Dale Calloway had left town shortly after the judge's letter arrived, headed back toward Colorado, and Etta found she did not think about him very much after that, because some things, when they finally stop pressing on you, simply stop pressing. She wrote to the territorial school board in November. It was Aaron's suggestion, but it had been her idea first, and the distinction mattered to her, and he understood why it mattered and was careful about it. The school board wrote back that there was a teacher shortage across 3 districts and that any qualified person should present themselves at the district office in Roswell with appropriate references. "You should go," Aaron said. "The survey extension takes you north," she said. "Roswell is east." "I know where Roswell is," he said. They were sitting on the porch on a cold November evening, wool blankets over their laps, the night sky performing its usual territorial extravagance of stars. The air smelled of wood smoke and sage. "I don't need you to follow me," she said. It was important to her that he understood that. She had not come this far to become dependent on another person's geography. "I know that," he said. "You don't need me to do anything. I'd like to, though. The survey work takes me north through the winter and then contracts are renewed in spring. Roswell is a bigger town. There will be more survey work there. It's not following you. It's wanting to be in the same place as you for reasons that go beyond the survey work." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very sharp in the cold air. "I think," she said carefully, "that I love you." He was quiet. Then, with the careful precision of a man who understands the weight of certain words, he said, "I know I love you. I've known it since the evening you told me about your mother, and you didn't cry, but your hands were very still in a way that meant you were not far from it. I thought about it for a week before I let myself understand what it was." Etta felt the warmth of it move through her like the first sun after a very long winter. "Then we'll figure out the geography," she said. "We'll figure out the geography," he agreed. December in Coldwater Creek was cold and quiet. The survey work had moved Aaron to the Northern Territory for 6 weeks, and Etta stayed at the boarding house and taught herself to miss him in a way that was not anxious or desperate, but simply the honest absence of a specific warmth. He wrote letters, long and particular letters, about the land he was surveying and the weather and the other surveyors, and small observations about the world that were more than observations, being actually observations about the two of them, about what they were building. She wrote back with equal length and greater frequency, because she had a lot to say, and she had been not saying it for a long time, and it turned out that she was an excellent letter writer. Mrs. Adler read one of the letters over her shoulder once without apology and said with approval, "You write like your mother taught you well." He came back to Coldwater Creek 2 days before Christmas. He came through the front door of the boarding house on a cold, clear afternoon, and Etta was in the kitchen, and she heard his voice in the hallway and came out without thinking, and he crossed the room in 3 steps, and she was in his arms without either of them quite deciding to make it happen. And he held her with the fervent relief of a man who has spent 6 weeks understanding exactly what he would be holding, and she held him back with everything she was. Mrs. Adler appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, said, "Supper is in an hour," and retreated with the dignified discretion of a woman who has earned her moments of satisfaction. Christmas that year was small and warm. Mrs. Adler had a 3-room parlor and a modest tree decorated with paper cutouts and dried berries, and there was a goose and a dried apple pie, and the 3 of them and a 4th boarder, an elderly traveling merchant named Mr. Hobbs who had been stranded by the cold. And they ate and told stories, and Etta played the old piano in the corner of the parlor that had been out of tune for 2 years and was still somewhat out of tune but produced music, which was the main thing. Aaron gave her a small book of maps, hand-drawn, of the territory he had surveyed, because he had known that she would find them beautiful and interesting, and she had found exactly that, turning the pages by lamplight with the absorbed attention she gave to things she loved. She gave him a new leather-bound survey notebook, because his old one was nearly full, and she had written on the inside cover in her careful schoolteacher's hand, "For all the things worth recording." He looked at it for a long time and then at her. In January, Aaron finished his contract extension and they talked seriously, over several evenings and one long Sunday afternoon, about what came next. The survey board in Roswell was offering a more permanent position, something with the territorial government that involved not just field work but the analysis and documentation of land claims, more settled work requiring a fixed address. It paid well. Roswell was a real town, larger than Coldwater Creek, with a school and a proper courthouse and more than one doctor. "I think we should get married," Aaron said. He said it on a Tuesday evening, which was not a particularly dramatic evening, which Etta later thought was exactly right, because the important things in life had a way of arriving not at the moment you'd arranged for them, but simply at the moment they were ready. She said yes, and the simplicity of it felt like the end of something very long and the beginning of something that had no particular end in sight, which was the best thing she had ever felt. They were married in February of 1883 in the small church in Coldwater Creek, in a ceremony performed by the minister, Reverend James Holt, who was a good man and glad for the occasion. Mrs. Adler stood as a witness on Etta's side. Aaron's fellow surveyor, a solid taciturn man from Texas named Frank Duell, stood on his. The church was cold, and the windows let in the thin February light, and Etta wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself over the preceding 3 weeks, working in the evenings, and Aaron wore his good dark coat and a clean white shirt, and he looked at her when she came down the short aisle with the expression of a man who has found the exact thing he did not know he had been looking for. She had written her own vows, as had he, because they were both people who understood that the most important things deserve the most careful words, and they said them to each other in the cold church with Reverend Holt and the 2 witnesses and old Mr. Hobbs, who had stayed through January and whose eyes were wet by the end of it, and the whole thing was very small and exactly what it should have been. Roy Calloway was not present, had not been invited, and had apparently, according to the town gossip that Mrs. Adler collected the way some people collected stamps, decided that whatever business he had had with Etta Wilcox was finished. It was finished. That chapter was done, and Etta did not look back at it. She was Etta Barnett now, which was a new name and a new chapter, and she carried it forward with both hands. They moved to Roswell in March, after the worst of the winter had passed. Mrs. Adler cried when they loaded the wagon, not theatrical tears but the honest ones of a woman who had genuinely enjoyed having them both in her house and was glad for them, and sad for herself in the uncomplicated way of people who love others more than they love their own convenience. Etta promised to write, and kept the promise, and they corresponded for years. Roswell in the spring of 1883 was bigger than Coldwater Creek by a considerable measure, with a proper hotel and 2 churches and a school and a courthouse, and enough commerce to sustain something like community life. It had been growing rapidly, as most territorial towns were growing, drawing settlers and speculators and working families from east of the Missouri, all of them looking for the particular combination of land and future that the territory seemed to be offering. Aaron's position with the Territorial Survey Office required him in Roswell Monday through Friday, and occasionally took him into the field for a week at a time. They rented a house on a quiet street, 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a small front porch that looked out over the wide Main Street, and Etta set about making it into something that felt like a home, which was a thing she had not had in 4 years, and set about with the thoroughness of someone who understood its value. She went to the school within the first week. The school in Roswell served approximately 60 children between the ages of 5 and 14, was run by a tired but capable man named Mr. Elias Prout, and was badly in need of a second teacher. Etta presented herself with her Missouri schooling, her reading and writing and arithmetic, and the one reference she had, which was a letter from Mrs. Adler describing her assistance with the boarding house accounts and her general character, which was a somewhat unusual teacher's reference but was, Mrs. Adler had made very clear, entirely accurate. Mr. Prout hired her on a trial basis that lasted 2 weeks before he told her she was the best thing to happen to the school since the building had gotten a second window. She taught the younger children, the 5 to 10-year-olds, in the mornings, and assisted Prout with the older ones in the afternoons. She taught reading from books she ordered from the same Denver bookseller that Aaron used. She taught arithmetic with the practical orientation of a woman who had managed boarding house accounts and understood that numbers were not abstract. She taught some history, some geography, and every afternoon she read aloud to the whole school for 20 minutes, different books, different worlds, because her mother had done that for her and she understood what it had given her. The children responded to her the way children respond to teachers who believe that what they're teaching matters. The school's attendance improved. Parents began to comment, and some of those comments reached Mr. Prout, and some of them reached further. Aaron watched all of this with the particular warm pride of a man whose love for someone is mixed with genuine admiration, and the mixture produces something better than either one alone. He worked his survey position with the same quiet competence he applied to everything, and began to build a reputation in the territorial office as someone who was both thorough and trusted. They were happy in the way that happy people often are, which is to say not without difficulty but with the resource to meet it. The survey work was sometimes dangerous and sometimes took Aaron away longer than planned. The school had its frustrations. Money was careful rather than comfortable. There were disagreements, the kind that happened between 2 strong-minded people, about things as various as household spending and the proper way to saddle a horse, and some of those disagreements were sharp before they were resolved. But they resolved them always, because they were both people who had come to understand the value of what they had, and neither of them treated it carelessly. In the fall of 1883, Etta discovered she was expecting. She told Aaron on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in the same plain, direct way she told him everything, and he sat very still for a moment and then stood up and came around the table and took her hands in both of his and held them and said nothing for a long time, and the nothing was full of everything. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said honestly, "and gladder than I know how to say." "Good," she said. "That seems appropriate." She continued teaching until April, when the physical reality of the pregnancy made the full school day difficult, and Mr. Prout managed without her for the summer with the help of a newly arrived teacher from Kansas, a young woman named Miss Abigail Trent, who turned out to be very good. Aaron was home more than usual that spring, having spoken with his supervisor at the survey office and arranged his schedule to minimize field work. He was, in ways large and small, extraordinarily attentive, not in the hovering, anxious way that would have irritated her, but in the practical, capable way of a man who had decided that his job was to make everything as manageable as possible and was going about it. He learned to cook 3 additional things beyond the eggs and salt pork that had constituted his domestic repertoire, and he kept the house cleaner than either of them had previously managed, and he read to her in the evenings, which she found she loved unreasonably, being read to. The particular intimacy of someone's voice carrying a story across the quiet of a room. In late June of 1883, on a Thursday that began with a thunderstorm and ended with the most extravagant rainbow Etta had ever seen arching over the Pecos River Valley, she gave birth to a son. The doctor, a small, energetic man named Dr. Thaddeus Crane, attended, and Mrs. Holt from the church, who had experience with such things, and Aaron, who was in the room because Etta had made it entirely clear that she wanted him there, and he had agreed without a moment's hesitation. The labor was long and hard, and there were hours in the middle of it when Etta thought uncharitable things about everyone involved, which was normal, and which she was honest about afterward with a humor that made Aaron laugh with the relief of a man who has been very frightened for several hours. The boy was named James Gerald Barnett. James for the Reverend in Coldwater Creek who had married them, and Gerald for her father because, whatever Gerald Wilcox's failures had been, he was her father and she had loved him, and she chose to remember the love. James was a loud, emphatic baby who made his opinions clear on most subjects and slept in intervals that suggested he had a great deal to think about and needed to be awake for most of the night to do it. Aaron, to his credit, took the night shifts without complaint with a dedication that impressed Dr. Crane and terrified Mrs. Holt, who had strong opinions about the proper division of infant care, which Aaron listened to politely and then ignored. Etta returned to the school in September. Miss Trent had agreed to stay on part-time, which gave them 2 proper teachers for the first time, and Mr. Prout was so relieved that he gave both women a small raise, which was not nothing. James grew with the focused efficiency of a healthy baby, becoming by his first year a solid, curious, dark-haired boy who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's absolute certainty about what he wanted. He crawled through the house and then walked with the immediate confidence of someone who had been waiting for this option, and he said words with the clear articulation of a child who has been read to every single day of his life. The territory was changing. The railroad came through in 1884, extending the AT and SF lines south and east, connecting Roswell to the larger network of commerce and travel that was pulling the territory toward statehood. More settlers arrived. The town grew. The school expanded to a proper 2-room building in the fall of 1884, with Etta and Miss Trent each occupying a room. Aaron was promoted to senior surveyor in the territorial office in early 1885, work that was more administrative and less field-based, which meant he was home most nights and had Sundays reliably, and they both found this improvement more substantial than they had expected. The evenings with James on the front porch, all 3 of them in the warm October air, watching the sun do its extravagant southwestern performance over the Pecos Valley, had a quality that Etta would later describe as the best feeling she had ever known, which was not romantic in the way that evenings at 22 are romantic, but was something deeper and steadier and more absolutely hers. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been in the Red Mare in Coldwater Creek in 1882, standing with folded hands near the bar while Roy Calloway disposed of her. She thought about it without the raw pain of it, the way you think about a scar after it's healed, aware of what it was, not reduced by it, carrying forward the knowledge of your own capacity to survive without letting the survival become the whole of your identity. She was not defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had built. In the spring of 1885, Etta discovered she was expecting again. She told Aaron at the kitchen table, same as before with coffee, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, came around the table and took her hands, and this time he also said with a smile that was all Aaron, "I am still terrified and still gladder than I know how to say." "Good," she said. "Consistency is important." This pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others. Easier because she knew the shape of it. Harder because James was 2 years old and deeply interested in everything, and required constant supervision to prevent him from investigating things that were inadvisable. Aaron's mother, Helen, who had come to visit the previous Christmas, wrote in April to ask if she might come and stay for the summer, and Etta wrote back that she would be extraordinarily welcome. Helen Barnett arrived in June on the new railroad, a compact, bright-eyed woman of 55 who had indeed remarried a decent man and lived in Denver, and who looked at Etta and then at Aaron, and then at their house and their life with the particular expression of a mother who feared one thing and found a different thing entirely. "She's wonderful," Helen said to Aaron, out of what she clearly thought was earshot of the kitchen, where Etta was in fact entirely within earshot. "I know," Aaron said. "I mean it, she's truly wonderful." "I know," Aaron said again, with the specific tone of a man who is both modest and deeply in agreement. Etta smiled into the mixing bowl and said nothing. In September of 1885, she gave birth to a daughter. The labor was shorter this time, which Dr. Crane seemed to find very satisfying. The girl arrived early on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun came through the bedroom window, and she was small and loud and had a quantity of dark hair that surprised everyone. They named her Clara Helen. Clara for Mrs. Adler, who received the letter informing her of this honor, and wrote back in a hand that was somewhat unsteady with emotion, and contained 3 separate mentions of how entirely unnecessary this was, and 4 mentions of how very glad she was. Helen for Aaron's mother, who was present and who cried with the uncomplicated openness of a woman who had learned late in life that joy was something to be expressed rather than contained. Helen stayed through October and then returned to Denver, and the house on the quiet street in Roswell contained, by November of 1885, a family of 4 that was noisy and imperfect and absolutely itself. James, at 2, regarded his new sister with a mixture of scientific interest and mild suspicion that gradually resolved, over the course of 3 months, into a possessive and rather touching protectiveness. He brought her things he considered valuable, primarily small rocks, and one particular wooden horse that had been his most treasured possession, and he sat beside her when she was on the blanket on the floor with the alert attention of someone fulfilling an important responsibility. Aaron watched this and said, one evening, that he thought they had managed to produce a very good person, and Etta agreed that it appeared so, and they were both quietly and enormously pleased about it. The school grew along with the town. By 1886, Etta had 3 teachers under her in what Mr. Prout was now calling, with the pride of a man whose institution has exceeded his initial ambitions, the Roswell Territorial School, and Etta herself had taken on what was effectively the role of head teacher, though the formal title did not exist yet. She was 28 years old, and she had what she had once stood in a Missouri classroom at 14 and imagined: a school, children who wanted to learn, and the ability to show them the world was larger than the one they could see from the classroom window. There were difficulties always. The territory had its injustices, the displacement of peoples who had been here long before any of them, the rough treatment of those who came without money or connection or the right accent, the ways in which opportunity remained more available to some than to others. Etta saw it in the faces of the children who came to school hungry, in the families who could not afford the books she ordered, in the children who did not come because their labor was needed at home. She did what she could with what she had. She petitioned the Territorial School Board for funding. She organized a book donation among the town's merchants that produced, in the spring of 1886, a small school library. She spoke at the courthouse meeting about compulsory education in a way that made several men uncomfortable, and that made change slowly, in the way change always makes change, slowly. Aaron supported all of this without exception, not with the condescension of a man permitting his wife her hobby, but with the genuine partnership of a man who considered her work as important as his own and organized his life accordingly. On their third anniversary, in February of 1886, they went to supper at the hotel dining room and left the children with a neighbor's daughter. And Etta wore a blue dress she had ordered from a catalog, and Aaron wore the good dark coat, and they sat across from each other in a room with real tablecloths and candles, and ate properly cooked food, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. "Do you remember what Roy Calloway said to you?" Aaron asked, at some point in the middle of the meal. "Which part?" "That I'd made myself an enemy." Etta considered it. "I remember. I think about it sometimes," he said, not with any worry, just as a kind of marker, what that night was. What it led to. What do you think when you think about it? He turned his glass slowly. "That $40 was the best money I ever spent," he said. She laughed, and the laugh was full and genuine and slightly inelegant. The laugh of a woman who is entirely comfortable and entirely happy. And Aaron watched her laugh with the expression he had given her ever since the evening on the porch in Coldwater Creek when she had said she wanted this too. The expression that was simply him being glad, without reservation or apology, and finding no reason to hide it. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a small package, wrapped in cloth. She opened it carefully. Inside was a tortoiseshell comb. 2 tortoiseshell combs, a matched pair, very like the ones she had worn that night in Coldwater Creek, the ones that had belonged to her mother. She held them for a moment, not speaking. "I found a craftsman in Santa Fe," Aaron said. "I described the ones you told me about. He made these. I know they're not the same as your mother's, but I thought they're perfect," she said. Her voice was steady, entirely steady. "They're exactly right." She held them for the rest of the evening. On the way home through the cool February night, walking the quiet Roswell streets with their hands together, and the stars doing their usual extravagance overhead, Etta thought about the thread of years that had brought her to this street, to this man, to this specific ordinary extraordinary evening. She thought about her mother, who had given her the things that mattered, the love of reading and the love of learning, and the knowledge that dignity was worth maintaining at cost. She thought about her father, who had been weak in the ways he had been weak, but who had also read to her sometimes on summer evenings, and who had called her his clever girl. She thought about Mrs. Adler in her boarding house in Coldwater Creek, saying there's pie in the kitchen. She thought about the saloon and the stranger at the bar who had said, in a voice that cut through noise, that she was neither a debt nor a transaction. She was herself. She had always been herself, even in the years when other people had tried to define her otherwise. And she was here in this town, in this life, walking under these stars with this man, and the life was hers in the fullest sense of the word. "What are you thinking?" Aaron asked. "That things worked out," she said. He squeezed her hand. "They did, against fairly significant odds. Also against those," he agreed. The following years continued in the way good years do, not without difficulty or loss, or the ordinary hard work of maintaining a life and a family and a school and a marriage, but with the underlying stability of people who have built something real and know how to take care of it. James started school properly at 5, which was complicated by the fact that his mother was one of his teachers, and navigated this with more grace than most 5-year-olds would manage, helped by the clear household rule that school was school and home was home, and the two ran by different protocols, which James accepted with the pragmatism of a child who understood that rules had reasons. Clara at 3 was a person of strong opinions and extraordinary vocabulary, who had apparently been listening very carefully to everything said around her since birth, and was now deploying it with precision. She called Mrs. Adler's picture, the lady who sent the letter about the combs. having absorbed this from conversations she should not technically have been following, and called Aaron surveying maps, the pictures of places that need looking at, which was, Aaron told Etta with real admiration, actually a very good description. In the spring of 1887, Roy Calloway died. He had been thrown from a horse east of Coldwater Creek, and the injuries proved fatal. Etta heard of it through a letter from Mrs. Adler, who reported it in the neutral tone of someone relaying information without adding to it. She told Aaron, and they were both quiet for a moment, and then she said that she did not know what to feel about it, and he said that she did not have to feel any particular thing, that it was enough to know it and let it be what it was. She wrote nothing on the matter in her journal, which was in some ways more eloquent than anything she might have written. Some chapters end, and the appropriate response is simply to close the book. Dale Calloway had been in Colorado since 1882 and was not mentioned again in any letters from Coldwater Creek, and Etta found that she had genuinely stopped thinking about him, which was its own form of resolution. By 1888, Etta was 30 years old, a mother of two, the effective head of a school that served 90 children, and one of the more known figures in Roswell by virtue of the simple fact that she had taught, at that point, almost every child in the town. People spoke well of her at the general store and at the church, not in the glowing terms that embarrass rather than honor, but in the practical terms of a community acknowledging someone who does their work with consistency and care. Aaron, at 32, had been appointed to a senior position in the Territorial Land Office, which was more political than his previous work, and occasionally frustrating for a man who preferred direct practical problems to bureaucratic ones, but which also gave him the ability to shape land policy in ways that, he told Etta one evening, he thought might actually help some of the families who were being squeezed out of their claims by larger operators who knew how to work the system. He worked at this with the same steady, determined competence he applied to everything, and he had some successes and some failures, and he was honest with Etta about both, and she was honest with him about hers, and this mutual honesty had become one of the things they both considered foundational to their marriage, the thing that kept it from becoming the kind of marriage where people live parallel to each other rather than together. In 1889, a third child arrived. Another boy, born in August of that year, during one of the hottest summers in the territory's recorded history, which Dr. Crane said he would remember as a professional challenge for the rest of his career. They named him Thomas Aaron Barnett, Thomas for no particular reason except that it was a good solid name, and Aaron for his father, because it was his father's name, and because Etta wanted at least one of their children to carry it. Aaron looked at the middle name on the record document for a long time. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I wanted it to be a surprise." He set down the document and gathered her very carefully. She was still in bed and tired in the way that a woman is tired after August labor in a New Mexico heat wave, and held her with the particular gentleness he reserved for the moments when he was afraid of expressing what he felt too roughly and losing the fineness of it. "Thank you," he said. "He has your chin," she said. "I thought the name was appropriate." Thomas, from the beginning, was a cheerful and uncomplicated baby in a way that James had not been, and Clara definitely had not been, and this even temperament was greeted by the entire Barnett household with the profound gratitude of people who have experienced what demanding infants are like. The years stacked up quietly. James at 8 was a serious, bookish boy who had inherited his father's interest in maps and his mother's love of reading, and who wanted, he told them at supper one autumn evening, to be an engineer when he grew up, because engineers built things that lasted, and he thought that was important. Aaron looked at Etta over the boy's head with an expression she had long since catalogued as the one that meant, "He's going to be all right." Clara at 6 was brilliant and combative, and already conducting negotiations with Mr. Pruitt's successor at the school, a young woman named Miss Reardon, with a sophistication that made Miss Reardon write Etta a note that said, in part, "I believe your daughter already knows more than I am going to be able to teach her, which I mean as a compliment. Etta read this and told Aaron, and they both tried very hard not to laugh in a way that would be overheard. Thomas at 1, and then 2, and then 3 was a sunlit, uncomplicated presence in the household, fond of dogs and horses, and his brother and sister with the undemanding affection of someone for whom affection is simply a natural condition of existence. In 1892, New Mexico was moving steadily toward statehood. The territorial government was active and often contentious, and Aaron was in the middle of a significant land rights case that had implications for several hundred families across the Pecos Valley. He came home tired some evenings, and Etta had learned over 9 years of marriage the difference between tired that wanted company and tired that wanted quiet, and she provided each as appropriate, which was, Aaron had told her on multiple occasions, one of the more extraordinary things about her. That summer, Mrs. Adler wrote to say that she was retiring the boarding house and moving to Albuquerque to live near her niece, and that she wanted Etta to know that the years in Coldwater Creek with Etta and that good man of hers had been among the finest of her life, and that she fully expected them to keep writing to her, which they did, for the remaining 12 years of Clara Adler's long and entirely satisfying life. Mrs. Adler came to Roswell first before Albuquerque on the railroad in September and stayed a week, and met Thomas and saw James and Clara grown from the small children she had heard about in letters, and sat on the front porch of the house on the quiet street and said, with the look she had given them on the boarding house porch 10 years before when she had seen their hands, "I always knew." "Knew what?" Aaron asked. "That it was going to be exactly this," she said, gesturing at all of it, the house and the street and the children and the two of them. "When I saw you walk in that door with $40 spent and a woman who looked like she'd just been given back to herself." Etta squeezed her hand and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "She always was herself," Aaron said quietly. "Nobody gave her anything." Mrs. Adler looked at him and then at Etta. "No," she agreed. "I suppose that's exactly right." The evening Mrs. Adler took the train to Albuquerque, Etta stood on the platform and watched until the train was gone and then stood a moment longer, feeling the quiet particular weight of time passing, the way people who were part of your story move forward and onward and the story continues, connected. Aaron was beside her, and after a moment he took her hand. "She was something," he said. "She was," Etta agreed. They walked home through the Roswell evening, autumn cooling the air, the mountains visible to the west in the clear light, and the house ahead with the warm windows that meant James was at the kitchen table with his maps, and Clara was reading something with complete disregard for the hour, and Thomas was presumably in bed but might very well have climbed out and be somewhere else entirely. Etta thought, walking toward those windows, that she had wanted a life with warmth in it. That was the simplest way to say it. She had been cold in the years before, cold in the way that comes from being treated as a means to an end rather than a person, and she had wanted warmth, not the warmth of comfort or luxury, but the warmth that comes from being known, being seen, being taken seriously by people who matter to you, being loved by someone who loves the specific person you are rather than a role they'd assigned to you. She had built that. She had built it herself, and she had built it with Aaron and the children and the school and the years. It was not an accident. It was not a rescue. It was the life of a woman who had been handed a very difficult set of circumstances, and had met them with the resources she had, and who had had the extraordinary good fortune, one night in a saloon in 1882, to be in the same room as a man who understood that she was neither a debt nor a transaction but a person, and who had been, every day since, the truest kind of partner she could have asked for. She thought about what she would tell her students if she were to tell them the true lesson of her own life. She thought she would tell them that the most important thing is to know what you are worth, not because someone tells you, but because you have worked it out for yourself and held on to it through the years when everything is trying to make you believe otherwise. She would tell them that love, the real kind, is not the answer to the question of worth, but rather the thing that finds you when you have already answered it yourself. She would tell them that the West was hard and beautiful and full of injustice, and that the injustice was real and should be named and fought, and that the beauty was also real and should be cherished and honored, and that the hard parts were also what made the good parts mean what they meant. She would tell them that there were strangers who were worth trusting. She would tell them that $40 and a steady voice in a loud room can change the entire direction of a life. Inside the house, Erin went to check on Thomas while Etta came into the kitchen to find James exactly where she'd expected him, bent over his survey maps with the lamp pulled close, and Clara in the front room in the reading chair with a book that was technically too advanced for her age and which she was reading perfectly well. "Supper dishes," Etta said. "Done," James said without looking up. "Thomas?" "Asleep," Clara said. "I checked. He talked to his horse for a while, but he's asleep now." "Good." Etta looked at her two oldest children, the 8-year-old mapmaker and the 10-year-old reader, and felt the warmth she had been seeking for so long, sitting in this kitchen, exactly as it had shaped itself into being. Erin came downstairs and met her eyes across the kitchen, and they had the brief wordless conversation of people who have been married long enough to speak in expressions, and the conversation was, "Everyone is accounted for, the house is well. This day is done, and it was a good one." She poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat down at the kitchen table, the same table that had hosted 10 years of conversations. And outside, the New Mexico night was doing its incomparable thing with the stars, and the mountains were dark shapes against the lesser dark of the sky. And the house was warm, and the children were where they should be, and the woman who had stood in a saloon with her hands folded, preparing for the worst, was sitting with her coffee, and the man who had spoken when no one else did. And none of it was borrowed or conditional or going to be taken away. James looked up from his maps. "Mama," he said, "do you think they'll let me work with Pa at the land office when I'm older?" Etta looked at Erin. Erin looked at her. "I think," Erin said to his son, "that you can do exactly what you decide to do if you're willing to work for it." "And you?" James asked his mother. "I think your father is right," Etta said, "and I also think that tomorrow is a school day and your maps will keep." James rolled up his maps with the tolerance of someone who has noted the suggestion, even if he does not agree with the timing, and said good night to them both with the particular combination of formality and affection that was entirely his own, and went to bed. Clara followed 5 minutes later, saying she had just been at a very important part, which was always true and was never sufficient justification but was always charming, and she kissed them each and went upstairs. The house was quiet. The coffee was warm. Etta and Erin sat at the kitchen table in the good long silence that only comes after years of talking, and outside the territory that was working its way toward becoming a state, continued its ancient and enormous business of being the land that it was, indifferent to the small warm houses and the lives inside them, and yet somehow providing the space in which those lives became themselves. "Tell me something," Erin said. It was a thing he had said for years at the end of evenings, the invitation to whatever was on her mind. "I was thinking about what we would have said," Etta said, "if someone had told us that night in Coldwater Creek what the next 10 years would look like. What do you think we would have said?" She considered it honestly. "I think I would have been afraid to believe it," she said. "I think I would have been very careful not to want it too much in case it disappeared. And now." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, the face she had been looking at for 10 years and had not finished looking at, the face of the man who had been still enough in a noisy room to be worth listening to, who had been honest with her from the first hour and had not stopped, who had held her hands at the announcement of children and the departure of old friends and all the ordinary profound moments of a shared life. "Now," she said, "I don't have any caution left to spend on doubting this. It's real, it's ours. I know exactly what it is." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had that night on the Coldwater Creek porch, the night everything had been decided, and his thumb traced the bones of her knuckles with the familiar attention of someone who has held your hand many times and not become careless about it. "It is," he agreed. "Every bit of it." The lamp burned. The stars continued. Somewhere upstairs Thomas made the small sound he made in his sleep, the contented rumble of a child deep in whatever good dream visited him. The house settled around them, their house, their particular place in the wide unfinished West, and Etta Barnett, who had been Etta Wilcox, who had once stood in a saloon with folded hands and been told she was a debt, sat in her kitchen in the fullness of everything she had built and loved and earned and been given and chosen, and felt nothing that needed any further addition, and everything that deserved to be kept.